apart, they were tiny.
Yeah.
So how do you reconstruct a whole scroll out of all these tiny pieces? It's like a jigsaw puzzle with not well-fitting pieces. So that's how they were able to do it, is you could not just look at the text you were supposed to be reading, but all the other texts under it, and really you could look at 3 or sometimes 4 layers,
Wow.
and you could see and make sure they all lined up. Wow. This is how it looked originally, and that's your scroll now, which is cool.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it was a whole science. Then they had to translate them all into English, right, or into all the different languages. And, in Europe, everybody was translating it for their own country, right? So then you could compare what you had to other stuff. So it's really been the biblical archaeology project of the 20th century has been the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah, that's really amazing. It's really amazing. So.
Since we're on this wormhole,
sure.
Can I? My wife asked a question the other day. We watched the movie Raiders of the Ark.
Oh, very awesome.
We were talking about, okay, the Ark was handled by a certain group of, a certain tribe of her Hebrews.
Yes.
And they were carrying it one day. I think they were carrying it into the city.
Yes.
And it started to fall.
Yes.
And someone tried
Grabbed
to support it.
And they died.
And he died.
Yes.
It seems cruel. I mean, he was trying to help.
Well, it's how do I put this? It's we tend to think of, again, this is that my journey being from philosophy to history.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think of philosophy as because my tendency is I tend to think of God in terms of attributes. He's all loving, all knowing, all powerful. That's a very Western way to think about God, and it's very influenced by the Western philosophical tradition, going back to the Greeks, but really getting going during the Renaissance, in the late Middle Ages, and what's called the scholastic tradition. I knew I'd get it. So that's the tendency to do theology in that way. But this is why I recommended that book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. This is an Eastern book, okay? Meaning Middle Eastern, okay? Their way of thinking is what informs this way of writing. And they weren't thinking of God in terms of his philosophical attributes. They were just having encounters with God. So Abraham's living out his life. He's planning to inherit the family business. And God says to him, Abraham, up, move, go. Abraham doesn't know anything about this God who's telling him to do stuff. He's just knowing he's hearing God tell him, talk to him personally. And he might not have even known that was the God. He's just going, hey, one of these spiritual entities I'm surrounded by, right? His whole family business is dedicated to manipulating these spiritual entities. One of these ones has picked me out, decided to talk to me personally. That's usually not a good thing if you know your mythology. The gods only choose humans in order to muck with their lives, and to play with the gods means to get yourself in big trouble. So he's probably terrified, but he's obedient. Because I know what happens when you're disobedient. So you go, and little by little, the stories we're reading are revealing the character of God to him. We're reading these 3,700 years later, going, well, we know that when we have an assumption of things about God, right? But our assumptions are formed by these interactions that God has. So when we talk about God being all-powerful, it's not like a generic idea that we had at the beginning. This is why we talked about the fact that he might be a henotheist, right? So where did I put my eraser stuff? Oh, someone helpfully threw away my rags. Well, let's see if I can get it to erase. Oh, I can almost. Okay. I know we've all seen this, but it's been a couple months since I wrote it up. So, there's a big debate on whether Abraham was a monotheist. A monotheist believes there's only one God, right? Christians are monotheists, Muslims are monotheists, Jews are monotheists. That means when we say we believe there's only one God, there's only one spiritual entity you can think of as God. There's lots of other spiritual entities, but they are less than God. Even if they claim to be a God, that means they're a demon. They're accepting worship, but it doesn't belong to them. A henotheist is different. A henotheist equals only worships one God. They might believe there are multiple gods, but they only worship one of them. That would have been as weird in the ancient world as being a monotheist. Monotheism, it's really unclear when that comes into focus for the Jewish tradition. That there is not only do we only worship one God, but there's only one God. It's really unclear when that becomes central to Jewish identity, scholarly speaking, from a standpoint of history. But henotheism means only worships one God. That's Abraham. Abraham only worships one God. He might believe there's other gods. He might believe in those gods that his dad had idols to, but he knows he's not supposed to do anything with them. He's called only to this one God and to serve him. That would have been strange because even if you were a priest of, I don't know, let's see in the Greek world, if you were a priestess of Aphrodite, you might still go across the way and ask Zeus for a favor here and there were mandatory days, right, where you had to do those things anyway. It was a part of your patriotic duty to go to certain temples on certain days. So you wouldn't have been, and it would have been the same thing in all the other gods. Anything you had a pantheon, you had multiple gods. You might have a special devotion to one god. Maybe it's the war god if you're a soldier, or maybe it's the god of scholarship if you're a scholar. But you're expected to pay attention to all of them and pay them all honor because at the bottom line, again, if you don't pay them honor, they mess with your life and no one wants that. So I've taken us a little bit far afield here, but remind me your original question.
Why the guy tried to hold up the ark because it was falling.
Right. Okay, so we tend to think of God as like God makes the decision to kill that person for touching it. Mm-hmm. But that's not at all what's going on there. Simply, remember we talked about there's two ways of encountering God, and the Jewish tradition really was starting to reckon with this around the time of Jesus. Sometimes it seems like you can interact with God and live, and other times if you interact with God, you die instantly, right? Death by holiness is a concept that's really hard for us to think about as modern people because and I'm not just because we're modern, but because we're Christian. And we believe that everyone who ever interacted with Jesus interacted with God. But they weren't interacting with God the Father. God is so holy that simply us encountering him because we have sin in us kills us instantly. Okay? So imagine that there's I guess all these zombie movies. I don't really know. I don't have no attraction for me. I've never seen a single zombie movie in my life. But apparently every one of these zombie movies is you have something like a virus that takes over the body and animates the corpse of the dead person when they're dead. So this virus hijacks a human being, okay? So imagine you've got a disease that if you encounter a certain thing, it'll kill you instantly, okay? That, in our perspective, that disease is sin. So if we encounter God, it's like encountering the remedy to our sin, but it'll kill us instantly. We've got a problem. Our sin can't come into God's presence because God's presence destroys sin instantly. It's more than oil and water. It's light and dark.
So then we go right to heaven.
Hmm?
Then we go right to heaven.
Or well, there you go. Yes, if we have faith. But that sense of like light destroys dark, right? Because dark is just the absence of light. There's no way to have light and dark in the same place at the same time. That's the way it is with God's holiness. If we encounter it, we're gone. And that's what happens to him. God's not making a decision to kill this person for touching the ark. Their encounter with the ark kills them. Period.
Does he go to heaven?
Maybe. How do I put this? I don't know his state before God when he did it. He dies.
Yes.
It destroys it. It kills him. Whether that means he enters into blessedness or not is a whole separate question, just like it is for all of us when we die. So encounter with the holy is destructive to that which is less than holy, because it's like the light replacing the darkness. You just can't. So this is why God distances himself. I remember we talked about this, but think about, we see God removing himself further and further from humanity in the book of Genesis, particularly in the first 11 chapters, right? In chapter 2, God walks with them in the garden. And by chapter 3, once they've sinned, they need to leave the garden. They need to be at a further distance from God because now God's presence to them will be destructive. And they get further and further distanced from God as we talk about. And this is why I really like this. I'm definitely channeling this guy from Baton Rouge now. Instead of talking about the fall of man where it happened once, is to talk about the falls where we get progressively further from God, including the story of the Tower of Babel, right? One more further distance away from God that we are, because again, we were trying to control God. Human beings were trying to control God. So God had to then scatter us into the nations and the different ways of speaking and thinking and stuff like that, in order to prevent us getting close to him. Because if we get close to him, we die. And we need to maintain our distance so he can bring us back the right way. What's the right way? Well, he takes on our sin, becomes sin. I alluded to it earlier. Some other time I'll tell you about what I just learned about what it means when St. Paul says, I don't even have to allude to it. It's a quick thing. He says, Christ, he who knew no sin became sin for us. I always thought, because I like philosophy, that meant sin is sort of like a category. God, he became this thing. That's not at all what it means. If you actually, I don't read Hebrew, I told you this. So if you actually read the Old Testament, when it talks about giving a sin offering, it literally says the people gave a sin to God. So that's what St. Paul's doing. He's thinking like a rabbi. He's not thinking like a philosopher. What does a rabbi say? How does a trained rabbi say? Oh, we offer a sin offering to God. But when you say it in Hebrew, you just say sin. So God, what he's actually saying is, God made him who knew no sin to become a sin offering for us. It's just he's using Greek, but he's using it in a Hebrew way. He's speaking like a Hebrew. So I can take all the things I thought about that section from 1 Corinthians and trash them because I was completely wrong about that. He's not doing philosophy. He's not setting us up for later scholastic theology. He's just saying, sin offering, right? We all know how this works. We've done it in the Old Testament lots of times. Here's my thank offering. Here's my sin offering. We know how this works. So he's actually saying God made Jesus a sin offering for us, a reconciliation. So not only is there the offering that's made to God, there's repentance that goes with the offering. That's how we approach God. That was my sermon 2 days ago, right? An attitude of constant repentance is how we approach God, because we're always in our sin turning away from God. So the way we approach God is with humility. The way we approach God is not to directly approach him in the sense of like, I'm entitled to be here, God. Nope, that would be the wrong way. We also don't approach him haphazardly with like, oh, it'll all work out if I just amble my way toward God. That results in death by holiness, right? It was an accident that this guy grabbed the ark. It still killed him. Okay? And we approach him intentionally through Christ, who is our sin offering. So under the covering of that sin offering, we approach with repentance. And that's not because God is so mean, but because God is so holy. And we'll get destroyed if we approach in any other way. So we need to enter through the appointed door, the narrow way, as Jesus says. Yeah. So I think those are all really helpful things to remember, especially now as we're going to get into this section of Genesis, because again, remember, Abraham doesn't know all the things about God we know. We're learning about God through God's interactions with Abraham. It's history that teaches us who God is, not thinking about God really, really well. That's the way the Greeks tried to get at God. That's how Aristotle got at God. And he got a fair distance, right? When you talk about the prime mover unmoved, that was Aristotle's language for God. It's like having that chain of dominoes of causality, right? But the first domino never falls. It pushes the other domino but stays standing or whatever, right? That's the prime mover who gets unmoved. Christians nuance that by saying, yeah, you need a finger to push the first domino. The first domino doesn't stand by itself. But it's pretty close. It's pretty close to the Christian conception of God or the Jewish conception of God. We know it by the story of Genesis, where God creates everything else, right? We talked about this when we did Genesis 1 and 2. What makes it different from all the other creation stories of the ancient Near East is that the gods are part of the stuff they're playing with, right? The gods are already on stage, or they are created as part of the process. How do we get the gods? Well, the gods were created by the creation of the world in some way, right? And there's a succession of gods. That's important to remember. Usually we get the gods we have now because they killed their parents in some way. And there's a full expectation. This is something we miss too. There's a full expectation that someday the children of the gods will kill them, and we'll have new gods to worship as human beings. There's this idea that it's always been here. We're going to be going around this cycle again and again. It's a cyclic view of history, right? A linear view of history is a Christian idea and a Jewish idea. And it's really unique. It's really unique in the whole world. The rest of the world, it doesn't matter whether you go to the ancient Far East like China and Japan, whether you go to Africa, whether you go to to North America, if you go to any of those native religions, the concept of time is like this. It's the same stuff again and again and again forever. And we've got gods, but and even if you have a creation story, it's still how we got this world we're in, not everything. All this stuff existed from time immemorial. How do we get the world we're living in is what the creation stories are about. The Genesis story is unique where God is assumed. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We're never told about where God comes from because God doesn't come from anywhere. God is the pre-existing condition for the creation of anything. That's a completely different concept of God than any human way of thinking. But that's revealed to us through the stories. And now we're going to learn about the character of God through the stories. We know God's all-powerful from Genesis 1. How do we know God is in any way loving? Well, how do we know he's in any way merciful? Let's start with mercy. We'll get to love in a minute, but let's start with mercy. How do we know he's merciful? That's what we're going to get from the passage that's upcoming here. Okay? All right. We're going to be in Genesis 18. And we talked about, we wrapped up with verse 21 last time. So we'll start at 22. And what we saw there was God sort of debating with himself, for lack of a better word. Do I show Abraham this stuff? Now, I don't know if we talked about this last time, looking up at my notes here. God's going to teach Abraham how to worship, right? This is his thing. And by teaching Abraham, we'll learn as his follower, as his progeny. But there's another piece we're going to see here that I really didn't get up here last time. Is what God is debating is... And the reason why this is recorded for us, right? Again, why would this be in the holy text? So we can learn it. It's not so we can be privy to all God's thoughts. But what we're going to get here is a picture of what Christians would call it salvation, but at least human destiny. What is human destiny going to be about, especially for the children of Abraham? So God's debate that we just passed over is about this. Do I include Abraham in my counsel? Right? He's entitled not to. He hasn't been so far. Abraham, get up, move. Right. A couple 100 miles. I'm not going to tell you why. Just do it. I'm going to tell you, at the end of it, you get a reward. I'll make you a blessing. You'll have great children, progeny, all this stuff, right? But do I include, and here I'm going to substitute for Abraham, mankind or humanity in my counsel? Do I let them know what I'm about? And I use the word counsel deliberately because there's a homonym for that. Do I include humanity in my counsel? So a council, C-I-L, is a group of people who consults with the king, right? Counsel means talking, understanding what God's doing behind the scenes, right? So this is going to escalate throughout history. This will be the first time that God includes a human being in his advisory committee, right? In his discussion committee. I shouldn't say advisory because God knows everything, but you know what I'm saying. Here, God's thinking about, deliberating about. And again, Christian conception of this would be not because he needs our help, but because he's raising us up to a new level, right? Teaching us, making us part of what he's doing in the world and helping us understand it. So do I include man in my counsel? This is going to elevate throughout time. More and more things are going to be revealed through what we call the Old Testament about the character of God. So it's going to be, And Matt, we just read the passage from Isaiah in worship. So, because we were talking about the inclusion of the Jews and Gentiles together, right, through Paul. And we saw Jesus healing a Canaanite woman, right? So who's going to be included in salvation in the end? Well, like I said, Isaiah is predicting the inclusion of the Gentiles 700 years before. Now imagine for a moment how striking that is. Because this is prophecy while you're in exile. So the Babylonians have captured the Jewish people. They've destroyed the Jewish state. They've destroyed the temple. You are now, the cream of the Jewish crop, the most important families are all in exile in Babylon and being trained to serve as functionaries in the Babylonian government. So this is what makes Daniel and, of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego so outstanding, is they refuse to bow. They refuse to be part of that. But most of this is when I talked about on Sunday about how when you talk about destroying a people, it's destroying their culture so it doesn't function ever again. This would be an example of that. Once you get a couple generations in, they're not going to remember how you lived in Judea. They're not going to remember how we lived in the Holy Land. They're not going to remember how God told us to live. And they're probably not even going to read the Jewish books anymore. And effectively, the Jews are gone. Okay? There may be lots of Jewish people running around, but they're effectively destroyed. They'll never function the same way again. That's what the Bible's talking about. This is a common way of acquiring land and consolidating it into your kingdom, is making the people unable to function without you. Right? There's some analogy in modern politics to making us completely dependent on the government. Okay? It's an old tactic, not a new one. So imagine that. But while you're in exile, reading Isaiah the prophet saying, God's plan is to include the Babylonians in salvation eventually. Oh, that's gotta. I mean, they're trying to destroy us. How is he going to? Why would he save them?
Yes.
Imagine how offensive that would be to read those passages around like Isaiah chapter 55 and stuff like this, where you're seeing all the nations. The Egyptians, our ancient enemies, the Babylonians and Persians, our modern enemies, all these, they're all coming to Jerusalem. Now that's the good news, right? They're coming to Jerusalem, which means maybe we're getting home. But they're coming to Jerusalem to worship the one God. Why does he just destroy them? That's what I want to do, right? So that's another thing, revealing God's character, right? It's so offensive to our human sensibilities. We keep going, that's the sin. We keep going back to better. I'm sure God doesn't want to save them. I'm sure he wants to destroy them, because that's what I would want to do. I'm going back to Psalm 3. I want to shatter their teeth on the rocks. I do not want God to save them. So we're going to keep vacillating as human beings, because we have trouble grasping onto the fullness of God's mercy and God's love and all that stuff. But this will culminate for us. For us as Christians, we get to hear it every year as we begin Lent. It's the last Sunday before Lent begins, the last Sunday of Epiphany, for us as liturgical Christians, is always the Transfiguration, right? So who shows up with Jesus on Mount Tabor during the Transfiguration?
Moses and Ezekiel. Elijah.
Yes, the other e-prophet, yes. Moses and Elijah, right, exactly. And they're there because they're part of the divine council. This is where the concept of sanctum comes from, in terms of when I say sanctum, not the way Protestants talk about saints, where it's everybody who's in Christ, but meaning the Roman Catholic idea or Orthodox idea, where these people have joined the council of God. So why can I ask them for a favor in prayer? Because they're part of the council. Okay? So it has these Jewish roots there. But Moses, why he's the great lawgiver and the great prophet, right? Why Elijah, though? I mean, he's a great prophet too, right? He dukes it out with... Well, one of the very interesting things that Elijah discovers that no other prophet before him does. Remember that we have a phrase, we draw from it regularly as Christians, but there's that scene where he's run away from Jezebel and he's being hunted to death, and he's like, God, there's no one left. And God's like, there's 7,000 more. You're not all that special, Elijah. He needs to tell Elijah he's not all he thinks he is. But Elijah's begging for him, and he says, well, I'll show you me. I'll speak to you. And then what you hear is there's a storm, right? There's a great and mighty wind, but God's not in the wind. Then there's a storm, but God's not in the storm. And then we're told that God, the translation usually used is, speaks with a still small voice. That's Elijah's discovery, is that God is in the little as well as the great. It's easy to worship God in power. It's hard to worship God in weakness. And that's the great discovery and the great contribution of Elijah to this tradition that we're all part of, and that's why he's part of the council of God. Because what's going to happen when Jesus leaves the mountain? In all three of the synoptic gospels where the transfiguration is recounted, he's instantly on the way to Jerusalem. That's why they leave the mountain. God, we will need to learn to see God in his weakness and smallness on the cross, as Elijah learned to hear him. Not in the storm, not in the great wind, not in the fire from heaven, but in the small, still voice. That's what we're all going to need to do. So Elijah's included in that. So as a clue for us as to what we need, how we need to read the next section of Jesus' story, or what's going to happen in the next section of the story that God is unfolding for us. So that's really, I think that's what we're seeing here, is that Abraham is going to get included. He's going to become the first human being included in the council of God. And what this is going to teach us about, remember, like I put up here, God's teaching Abraham how to worship, because he doesn't know how to worship the true God. He only knows how to worship false gods. And he's going to show him what a relationship looks like. It's going to be faith and trust. But it's not faith and trust without give and take. And this is going to become important. Later on, Israel will take its name from God renaming Jacob, right? Jacob means liar, trickster. Israel means he who wrestles with God. And so this will get what was going to be revealed to us in the next section by Abraham's interaction with God is going to be an aspect of God that we wouldn't expect from the all-powerful God of the universe, which is that we can talk with him, we can wrestle with him, we can, as long as it's an honest interaction, we can contend with him. Now, there may be times when, like Job, our contention ends up him saying, "You sit down and shut up while I talk." Right? That's how Job ends. But we're going to see a little bit different reaction here. It's still a relationship of trust, but Abraham is going to arm wrestle with God a bit about what the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah might look like. Okay, and under what conditions it might happen. All right? So since it is already 10 after 12, we will prepare. We will be prepared now to jump back into the Genesis text. This is all a Tuesday of preparation. And we'll recap a little bit of this to get us started. Because if all goes well, next week we'll have Barb back. We'll watch the end of the documentary and then discuss it about what's the timing on the Exodus story. Because that's the fulfillment of the promises that God made to Abraham that he'll inherit the land. The Exodus story is God fulfilling the promise he makes here in Genesis. And then we'll jump back into 18 probably the week after that. And really start to look at this, what happens as in this story surrounding Sodom and Gomorrah. And that'll be the Tuesday after Labor Day. Okay? All right. And none of my cameras froze up this week. That's so exciting. So I felt so badly. We had such a good session last week and none of it streamed. It all locked